The young novice's screams echoed through the stone corridors of Cluny Abbey as the iron discipline rod struck his bare back for the 7th time. It was the winter of 1147, and Brother Thomas had committed an unforgivable sin. He had smiled during Matins, the pre-dawn prayer service. The rule of Saint Benedict was absolute. Let nothing be preferred to the work of God. His punishment would last 3 days, each morning bringing fresh welts across shoulders already raw from previous beatings. But Thomas's ordeal had only begun. After the flogging, he would spend the next week eating nothing but bread and water, while sleeping on the stone floor of his cell without even a thin straw mattress. His fellow monks would shun him completely, treating him as if he were already dead. The Chronicle of Cluny records that Thomas begged for mercy on the 2nd day, weeping as he prostrated himself before the abbot. The response was swift and merciless, an additional day of punishment for the sin of pride in believing he deserved compassion. This was not an isolated incident of medieval cruelty. This was Tuesday morning, in one of Europe's most prestigious monasteries. What the modern mind struggles to comprehend is that Brother Thomas's brutal punishment wasn't considered excessive or unusual. It was considered merciful. The medieval monastery represented one of history's most sophisticated systems of psychological and physical control, where every aspect of human nature was systematically crushed in service of spiritual purity. These weren't simply places of prayer and contemplation. They were institutions designed to break the human spirit so completely that death became preferable to disobedience. The documented accounts from medieval monasteries reveal a world of orchestrated suffering that makes modern prison systems seem lenient by comparison. These holy men, revered by society as the pinnacle of devotion, lived under conditions that would today be classified as systematic torture. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by monasteries across Europe, wasn't merely a guideline for religious life. It was a manual for the complete annihilation of individual will. The evidence exists in hundreds of surviving manuscripts, punishment records, confession transcripts, and the personal testimonies of monks who dared to document their experiences. What emerges is a portrait of institutionalized brutality disguised as divine service, where men volunteered for a living hell in pursuit of salvation. The monastery bell tower held more than bronze and iron. It contained an instrument of systematic sleep deprivation that would destroy a modern person's sanity within days. The monastic day began at 2:00 a.m. with the bell for matins, followed by lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Between these 8 daily prayer services, monks were expected to engage in manual labor, study, and private devotion. The Customary of Cluny reveals the horrifying mathematics of monastic sleep. On average, monks received between 3 and 4 hours of uninterrupted rest per night. During Lent and Advent, this was reduced further. The Chronicle of Hirsau Abbey documents cases of monks falling asleep during prayer services and suffering brutal consequences. Brother Wilhelm collapsed during Matins in 1156 and was sentenced to sleep standing upright in the chapel for the next month, his wrists bound to prevent him from lying down. But the sleep deprivation served a calculated purpose. The medieval church understood that exhaustion made men compliant, that fatigue eroded resistance to authority. The Vita Sancti Brunonis describes how Carthusian monks would hallucinate from exhaustion, seeing visions they interpreted as divine communication. Modern sleep research confirms what medieval abbots knew intuitively. Chronic sleep deprivation produces psychological symptoms indistinguishable from religious ecstasy. The records from Monte Cassino reveal the ultimate horror. Monks who died from exhaustion were celebrated as martyrs, their deaths recorded as proof of exceptional devotion. Brother Marcus, according to the abbey's death register, collapsed during morning prayers in 1203 and never awakened. The abbot declared his death a blessed release granted by God to his most faithful servant. Medieval monasteries didn't simply limit food, they weaponized hunger as a tool of spiritual warfare. The rule of Saint Benedict decreed that monks should never be satisfied, and medieval abbots interpreted this with devastating literalism. The surviving meal records from major monasteries reveal a systematic starvation protocol that would today constitute a war crime. During regular periods, monks received 2 meals per day, a midday meal after sext and a light evening meal before vespers. But regular periods comprised less than half the liturgical year. Lent brought 40 days of bread and water. Advent demanded 3 weeks of fasting. Ember days occurred 4 times yearly, each requiring 3 days of near-total food restriction. The feast days of major saints brought additional fasting requirements. The regulations of Cîteaux describe the Cistercian practice of perfect abstinence, where monks consumed nothing but water for days at a time. The document coldly notes that brothers who fainted during these periods were refreshed by the grace of God and expected to continue their fast upon awakening. Those who broke their fasts faced public humiliation and extended punishment that often included sleeping in the monastery's morgue among the corpses of deceased brothers. Perhaps most disturbing were the communal fasts, documented in the annals of several major monasteries. When one monk violated the rules of abstinence, the entire community would be punished with extended starvation. The Cartulary of Saint-Denis records an incident in 1189 where Brother Pierre was discovered eating berries during Lent. The entire monastery was sentenced to consume nothing but bread and water for an additional 2 weeks. 3 elderly monks died during this extended punishment, their deaths attributed to divine will rather than institutional cruelty. The physical effects of chronic malnutrition are meticulously documented in medieval medical texts associated with monasteries. Monks suffered from scurvy, rickets, severe anemia, and what modern medicine recognizes as starvation-induced psychosis. Yet these symptoms were interpreted as signs of spiritual progress, evidence that the flesh was being successfully subjugated to the spirit. The great silence of medieval monasteries wasn't simply a rule about quiet prayer. It was a systematic program of psychological isolation that destroyed human connection and individuality. The customary of B. Abbey documents a silence so complete that monks developed an elaborate sign language to communicate basic needs. But even these gestures were severely restricted and monitored. The punishment records from Canterbury Cathedral Priory reveal the horrifying enforcement of monastic silence. Brother Edmund was sentenced to 3 months of solitary confinement in 1298 for speaking aloud during the night office. His crime? Warning a fellow monk that he was about to fall down stone steps in the darkness. The judicial proceedings, recorded in meticulous detail, show that Edmund's act of compassion was deemed a violation worthy of the harshest punishment short of expulsion. But the silence served a more insidious purpose than mere discipline. The medieval church recognized that human beings require communication to maintain their sanity and sense of self. By severing this fundamental need, monasteries created a form of psychological conditioning that made monks completely dependent on the institution for any form of human connection. The Speculum Monachorum describes how prolonged silence led to a condition called monastic melancholia, where brothers would lose the ability to speak coherently, even when permitted. The records from several monasteries document cases of monks who suffered complete psychological breaks from enforced silence. The Chronicle of St. Albans describes Brother Geoffrey, who after 7 years of near-total silence, was found in his cell speaking to imaginary companions. Rather than receiving medical attention, Geoffrey was celebrated as having achieved communion with angels. He died 3 months later, still conversing with his hallucinations. Most chilling are the documented cases of monks who forgot how to speak entirely. The Acta Sanctorum records the case of Brother Simeon of Cluny, who after 20 years of monastic silence was granted permission to speak during his final confession. The attending priest noted that Simeon could only produce animal-like sounds and had to communicate his sins through primitive gestures. The Church declared this a miracle of humility rather than recognizing it as evidence of psychological destruction. Medieval monasteries perfected the art of systematic humiliation through rituals designed to destroy every vestige of human dignity and self-respect. The chapter of faults, held weekly in most monasteries, transformed confession into a public spectacle of degradation that would today be recognized as psychological torture. The constitutions of Cluny describe the ritual in clinical detail. Monks were required to prostrate themselves naked before the entire community and confess not only their sins, but their sinful thoughts, desires, and dreams. The assembled brothers would then vote on appropriate punishments, often competing to suggest the most severe penalties as proof of their own righteousness. The records show that these sessions frequently lasted for hours, with individual monks forced to remain prostrated on cold stone floors while their every human weakness was dissected and condemned. The customary of Grandmont documents the practice of fraternal correction, where monks were encouraged to spy on each other and report the slightest infractions. Brother William of Thierry's letters describe a monastery where trust was impossible, where every gesture was monitored and every private moment subject to scrutiny. Monks learned to sleep with their hands visible above their blankets to prove they weren't engaging in impure touching. They ate with their heads bowed, not in prayer, but to prevent any monk from meeting another's eyes and forming a human connection that might threaten institutional control. Perhaps most devastating were the public penances documented in monastery records across Europe. The Chronica Majora describes the case of Brother Albert of Rivaux, who was forced to crawl on his hands and knees through the monastery grounds for 30 days while carrying a wooden cross weighing 40 pounds. His crime was excessive attachment to a fellow monk. They had been observed speaking together more than once per week. Albert's punishment culminated in a ceremony where he was forced to publicly renounce his friend and declare his natural human affections sinful and worthy of damnation. The psychological impact of these rituals was precisely calculated. The Speculum Caritatis explains the theological reasoning. Human dignity was considered the root of pride, and pride was the foundation of all sin. Therefore, the complete destruction of dignity was not merely acceptable, but necessary for salvation. Modern psychological research confirms that systematic humiliation produces learned helplessness, dissociation, and complete dependence on authority figures, exactly the psychological state that medieval monasteries sought to achieve. The vow of stability taken by medieval monks wasn't simply a promise to remain with one monastery, it was a commitment to psychological and physical imprisonment that lasted until death. The walls of medieval monasteries weren't built to keep the world out. They were designed to ensure that no monk could ever escape the systematic destruction of his humanity. The Cartellary of Mont Saint-Michel reveals the true horror of monastic enclosure through its detailed records of failed escape attempts. Brother Rogerius scaled the monastery walls in 1204, but was recaptured within hours by local authorities who were legally bound to return escaped monks. His punishment was recorded with bureaucratic precision: solitary confinement for 6 months, followed by being chained to the altar during all prayer services for the remainder of his life. The chronicle notes that Rogerius was still shackled to the altar when he died, 17 years later, his ankles permanently deformed by the iron fetters. But physical escape was only one impossibility facing medieval monks. The economic system of monasteries ensured complete dependence that made survival outside the walls virtually impossible. The Gesta Abbatum of St. Albans documents how monks surrendered all personal property upon taking their vows, and how the monastery systematically severed all connections to family and former life. Letters from family members were intercepted and destroyed. Former friends were turned away at monastery gates. The institution became literally the only source of food, shelter, and human contact available to its prisoners. The records from several major monasteries reveal the psychological conditioning that made escape seem impossible even when physical opportunity arose. The rule of St. Benedict was internalized so completely that monks developed what modern psychology recognizes as Stockholm Syndrome. They identified completely with their captors and interpreted any desire for freedom as evidence of their own moral failure. The Vita Sancti Bernardi describes monks who were accidentally locked outside monastery walls overnight and spent the entire night weeping and begging to be readmitted to their prison. Most disturbing are the documented cases of monks who achieved temporary freedom but voluntarily returned to their monasteries. The Chronicle of Bury St. Edmunds records the case of Brother Thomas, who escaped during a fire that destroyed part of the monastery walls in 1198. He lived freely for 3 months before returning and begging for readmission. His reason, recorded in his own confession: "The world outside these walls is so vast and filled with choices that I cannot bear the weight of my own freedom." Thomas spent his remaining years in chains as punishment for his temporary escape, and his own letters reveal that he considered these chains a blessing that protected him from the terrible burden of free will. The most twisted aspect of medieval monastic life was not the brutality itself, but the sophisticated theological framework that transformed systematic abuse into divine blessing. The very men who endured unthinkable suffering became the most zealous enforcers of the system that destroyed them, creating a cycle of violence that perpetuated itself across centuries. The letters of Peter the Venerable reveal this paradox in horrifying detail. As abbot of Cluny, Peter oversaw one of Europe's most brutal monastic regimes, yet his personal correspondence shows genuine belief that he was performing acts of love. When Brother Matthias died from infected wounds caused by disciplinary flagellation, Peter wrote to the monk's family describing the death as a crown of glory earned through sacred suffering. The letter includes graphic descriptions of Matthias's final days: fever, delirium, and gangrenous flesh, presented as evidence of God's special favor. This theological contradiction reached its apex in the phenomenon of voluntary martyrdom within monastery walls. The Chronicon Universale documents cases of monks who actively sought out the most severe punishments, competing with each other to demonstrate superior devotion through greater suffering. Brother Francis of Assisi, not the famous saint, but a lesser-known monk of the same name, convinced his abbot to allow him to sleep in the monastery's cesspit for an entire winter. The chronicle records that Francis emerged in spring with severe infections and permanent lung damage, yet was celebrated throughout the region as a living saint. The most disturbing paradox involved the monastery's role as both destroyer and preserver of human dignity. While systematically crushing individual will, these institutions simultaneously claim to offer the highest form of human existence. The regular magistracy explains this contradiction through the concept of sacred death, the idea that complete destruction of natural human impulses was necessary to achieve supernatural rebirth. Monks who survived the psychological annihilation were held up as proof that the system worked, while those who died or went insane were dismissed as insufficiently committed to their spiritual transformation. The economic hypocrisy was equally stark. Medieval monasteries accumulated vast wealth through the labor of men who owned nothing and received nothing for their work. The Domesday Book reveals that major monasteries controlled enormous estates worked by monks who lived in conditions of deliberate deprivation. The Cartulary of Glastonbury shows that while the abbey's treasury overflowed with gold and precious stones, donated by wealthy patrons seeking spiritual merit, the monks who maintained this wealth were forbidden to touch money and punished severely for expressing any material needs. Perhaps most perverse was the monastery's simultaneous rejection and dependence upon the outside world. While monks took vows renouncing worldly concerns, their survival depended entirely on the economic and political systems they claimed to reject. The Chronicle of Battle Abbey documents how abbots wielded enormous political influence, while their monks were forbidden to speak. These holy men, who had supposedly transcended worldly concerns, spent their days managing vast commercial enterprises built on the unpaid labor of men who had surrendered their freedom in pursuit of spiritual purity. The medieval monastery stands as perhaps history's most successful experiment in the systematic destruction of human nature, disguised as its perfection. These institutions didn't simply fail to achieve their stated goals of spiritual enlightenment. They succeeded perfectly at their actual purpose. the creation of broken men who could no longer conceive of existence outside the walls that confined them. The surviving records paint an inescapable conclusion. Medieval monasteries weren't corrupted versions of Christian ideals. They were the logical extreme of those ideals when applied without mercy or human understanding. The rule of Saint Benedict, implemented with medieval precision, created conditions that modern psychology recognizes as designed to produce complex post-traumatic stress disorder, learned helplessness, and complete psychological dependence on authority figures. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of manuscripts document the deaths of monks from starvation, exhaustion, infected wounds from corporal punishment, and suicide. The Chronicle of St. Bertin records 97 monk deaths in a single year at one monastery, most attributed to failure of spirit rather than the systematic abuse that actually killed them. These weren't isolated incidents at corrupt institutions. They were the predictable outcomes of a system designed to break human beings in service of divine will. What makes the medieval monastery uniquely horrifying isn't the brutality itself, but the complete absence of recognition that brutality was occurring. Every act of cruelty was reframed as kindness, every moment of suffering celebrated as progress towards salvation. The psychological conditioning was so complete that victims became perpetrators, and perpetrators believed themselves to be saints. The system created its own justification through the very destruction it caused. The monasteries that survived into the modern era were forced to abandon most of their medieval practices, not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective. A system that could transform intelligent, capable men into broken shells, dependent on institutional approval for their very sense of reality, was ultimately too dangerous, even for the church that created it. The modern mind recoils from the medieval monastery, not because it failed to achieve transcendence, but because it succeeded too well at demonstrating the depths of cruelty that human beings will inflict upon each other when convinced that suffering serves a higher purpose. These holy men, in their pursuit of heaven, created a very real and tangible hell on earth, one administered with bureaucratic precision and theological certainty. The final, devastating irony is that many medieval monks genuinely achieved what they sought: complete freedom from worldly concerns, total submission to divine will, and absolute certainty about their purpose in life. They found their peace through the annihilation of everything that made them human. In the end, the medieval monastery succeeded at its ultimate goal. It created men who were no longer quite men, who had traded their humanity for the promise of something greater, and who died believing they had received the better bargain. Perhaps the most disturbing question raised by the medieval monastery isn't whether such extreme devotion was justified by its spiritual rewards, but whether the human capacity for voluntary self-destruction in service of absolute beliefs has truly disappeared, or simply found new forms in the modern world. What other historical institutions claim to elevate humanity while systematically destroying everything human about their subjects?